Now, how do we determine what matters with Scripture? You know, it's interesting. I have two daughters, and they're now in the higher teenage status years, and that's interesting. But when they were younger, you know, it's amazing. Even before they had any significant schooling, they were able to determine, if you can believe this, they were able to determine when mommy and daddy really meant something in their rules, right? I mean, they didn't need a PhD for this. How can you determine what matters? Well, when you're a child, I guess, when you're, let's say in my family household, if it's a summer and there's no school the next day, and my daughter twists my finger and says, you know, I would really like to watch the following program, Daddy, even though it's past my bedtime. I won't tell you who the normal weak link in my household is on that, but it does tend to be me, but no names mentioned. And they realize they can get away with certain things like that. On the other hand, when the Barbie wars occurred in the history of their development, and you got my Barbie, or I want that Barbie, or I want that clothes, and then it could degenerate into combat, right? Then it became very clear that mommy and daddy really don't brook any use of physical force on one another, right? They knew that was a completely non-negotiable element of our parenting. Now, how did they know that? Are they brilliant? Well, yes, they are. I confess that about my children. They are brilliant, but that's just my little personal pet peeve and prejudice. But they also could see certain indicators on the part of their parents, right? Like we've consistently made no exceptions, like the tone of our voice changes, like the sound quality, the elevation of the volume, it might increase slightly, the degree to which we express horror or shock at what they're doing. They get loads of signals from parents. So when people say, how can you determine what's a core value of Scripture? It's really actually not that hard when you think about it. Values that are pervasively held within Scripture, both Testaments. You might say, well, some people might say there aren't many things said about homosexual practice within Scripture. They don't have to, because a few times it's mentioned, it's pretty severely viewed. And every narrative, every law, every proverb, every poetry, every metaphor, every genre of Scripture when it talks about sexual ethics, always presupposes a male-female requirement. There's never any exception. So when you combine that with the very strong, explicit statements that are given, it's pretty clear. It's like, you know, bestiality. How many times is bestiality prohibited in the New Testament? 0. No explicit statement. But does anyone seriously want to argue that bestiality is negotiable? No, it's because it's such beyond the pale of anything could possibly be accepted. You don't even have to talk about it. You can make a case that the opposition to bestiality is pervasive in both testaments of Scripture, irrespective of the number of times it's explicitly mentioned. A value that's absolutely held, meaning no exceptions, right? Even in incest, there are some exceptions, not in the core incest stuff, like with siblings, parents, children. That's pretty straightforward at the beginning. But how far do you carry out the incest line beyond the nuclear family? That's where there's some debate within Scripture, some fraying of the edges, right? There's some exception, not absolutely held at all dimensions, only in the interior core. In the case of homosexual practice, there's never any exception provided, ever, under any circumstances. It's an absolutely held value, a strongly held value, by which I mean that the penalty is as severe as it gets, right? In Scripture, in the Old Testament, capital sentencing for homosexual practice, and a series of stories in which homosexual practice figures conspicuously, which stories are viewed as exemplars of depravity. It pretty much makes clear how severe the issue is. When Paul deals with homosexual practice in Romans 1, he lifts it up as a particularly conspicuous example of the deliberate suppression of the truth about the way God made us. I mean, you have to have a lot of years of education to suppress that truth. I mean, it takes a PhD for most people. I mean, it's tremendous. I somehow didn't get on board. I don't know what happened. And then, let's suppose in addition to being pervasively, absolutely, and strongly held, it's also held in opposition to prevailing cultural trends. right? So the view of homosexual practice in ancient Israel, early Judaism, and early Christianity, we find nothing to that degree of severity anywhere in the ancient Near East or the Greco-Roman Mediterranean basin. So this is not just I'm naively imbibing at the cultural well. This is a recognition that we stand out from everybody else in our viewpoint on this issue, and yet we will maintain it anyway, right? Hint, hint, what should we do in the church now when the culture repeatedly changes? Get on board with the culture? No, that's not been a biblical position on the issue. And it's been the view, pervasive view, strongly held view, absolute view for 2 millennia. Only in the last 35, 40 years has this been entertained, right? So everyone else, they were just complete dunces and idiots up to this point. There's a certain arrogance to that way of viewing church history as somehow we are sort of elitists in our knowledge nobody else had access to previously. Now, any one of those things would sort of indicate a core value. Now, you bring together all 5 of these elements together, which is what happens in the issue of homosexual practice. It's really not a tough one to figure out. This is a core value in biblical sexual ethics.